Here to help us break it down, we have Abeer Omar. She's Bloomberg News Deputy UAE Bureau Chief. Thank you so much for joining us. Skylar Woodhouse is with us here at the table. She is a White House reporter for Bloomberg. And we also have Konstantin Toropin. He's the AP's Pentagon reporter. Abeer, I want to start with you. It was, I regret to, I'm loath to say, but almost slightly quieter overnight. There were still some attacks, including this rocket that went towards this base in the Indian Ocean. Can you just kind of give us the update, what happened overnight, what you were seeing throughout your region, and where we start the morning?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning. Look, I mean, the intensity of the Iran attacks has lessened, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been happening across different Arab Gulf regions. Now, some things that we're looking at essentially is that this is the third week of the war, but the intensity or the degree of Iranian attacks has been continuing. And as a matter of fact, we can say that they've reached new heights because Iran is now retaliating against some of the key energy infrastructure in the Arab Gulf. Over the week, they've attacked multiple ones, including Qatar's largest LNG plant that wiped out potentially 17% of LNG exports across the globe. This is the Ras Laffan plant in Doha. And Qatar did come out and say that it will take 3 to 5 years to fully repair those key plants in its territories. And those LNG exports are going to have an impact across different countries in Asia, like China and South Korea, but also those in Europe, including Belgium, for example, and Italy. This is what Qatar said. And this is not just in Qatar. This is just one of the widest attacks that have happened over the past week. And as you know, LNG is not like crude in the way it works because we don't have reserves. We can't have a policy response to replace missing LNG exports. So this is set to have massive impacts across the LNG industry, unlike what is happening with crude, which is already at 112, WTI close to 100. So we're seeing those big moves as a result of the President Donald Trump's administration's commentary overnight. So that is what we're seeing across oil markets. But when it comes to LNG, this is again a massive move, and we're looking forward to what more Iran or what Iran is going to target next. But it looks like the retaliation is not stopping. What we've seen overnight, the attacks on the British airbase, that's also something that we did not, or the U.S. administration, according to our sources, had not factored in Iran had the ability to do. So yes, since the start of the war 3 weeks ago, or over 20 days ago across the Middle East, we've seen the number of attacks from Iran slightly lessen. But that doesn't mean that the parameters of this war have not been intensifying across the region.
Skylar, that's the backdrop to what we're hearing from the President of the United States. He's, of course, taking note of all that's happening within the region and looking at the market response as well, which has been significant since the start of this conflict. How do you square that, what we're seeing, this conflict continuing to widen, show no signs of slowing down? Yes, he ruled out the prospects of a ceasefire, but that begs the question of if military action on the U.S.'s part were to cease, what would Iran's response to that be going forward here? Parse, if you could, that statement that we got from the president last night, that 5-point statement about objectives that he says the U.S. has reached or is close to reaching.
I think it's a very interesting statement that we saw from the president yesterday, especially as earlier in that day he ruled out a ceasefire, and then now he's saying that they're going to be winding down the war. So it is very interesting that the president sort of adjusted his tone very quickly, and it almost makes you wonder who got in his ear, what happened behind the scenes. I mean, that's something we're all trying to figure out, is what were those conversations like behind the scenes that sort of shifted the president's thinking around this war. And I think one thing to note more broadly here in the U.S. is for President Trump, the Republican Party, the administration, it is a midterm here in the U.S. And obviously with higher cost of oil, gas prices here in the U.S., they're having to navigate that as, you know, the November elections near. And especially at a time where U.S. service members have been killed. And it's, you know, it raises questions on if we are going to, when I say we, the administration, if they're going to continue with this war, how much is it, I guess, worth it if, especially, you know, there's the risk of troops continuing to be wounded and killed.
And on that note, I mean, putting American forces in harm's way, Konstantin, I want to ask you, there's been successive reporting about whether or not the president will use ground troops, and he's been asked about it, and whether or not he really wants to go in and hold Karg Island. And we've got some reporting from Axios that says, the Trump administration is considering plans to occupy or blockade that island to pressure Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I was reading this week that an amphibious assault, if this administration does decide to go forward with that, won't look like the ones we've seen in the past when we think D-Day and those kinds of boats. One of those carriers doesn't even really have a well to launch those boats. What are the odds of that assault happening, and what will it look like if it does?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So the U.S. military has now sent 2 separate Marine expeditionary units towards the Middle East. One was coming from one was doing exercises off the island of Taiwan. It has been rerouted to the Middle East, and that group is made up of 2 amphibious assault ships led by the USS Tripoli. And then yesterday, we reported that the USS Boxer Amphibious Readiness Group, that's made up of 3 amphibious assault ships, that's heading to the Middle East as well. So, sort of to answer your question, it certainly appears that one of the options that's being teed up here is to have U.S. Marines seize the island via the ocean.
But do you think, will that look like what we're picturing with fast boats and men in the water, or is there a modern version of that? I was reading it's more likely to be kind of a targeted assault with like choppers coming off these carriers, fewer men in the water, and more of an air assault being launched from these boats. I don't know if that's even something we can answer at this point, but I just found that interesting because when I think amphibious assault, I guess my brain is still going Saving Private Ryan.
Right. I mean, I think if the military does go down that path, which, to be clear, we don't have any indication sort of one way or the other. But yeah, I think it'll probably be a blend of the two. I doubt it's going to be absolutely Saving Private Ryan with, sort of waves and waves of amphibious assault craft. But I think it'll look a little bit like that. I mean, the Marine Corps still utilizes modern versions of those kinds of crafts. So, probably some version they're in.
Abeer, I want to go to the Strait of Hormuz, the traffic that we've seen or the lack thereof, and Bloomberg's reporting that an Indian tanker did get through. We've seen kind of a series of this happening over the course of the last week, a handful of vessels getting through. If the flags of those vessels, if those countries are able to communicate with Tehran and negotiate some sort of deal here. Can you just get us up to speed on what that negotiation has been like, the degree to which some traffic has returned here, and sort of what is still on the minds of carriers and captains and insurers as this conflict continues?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the Strait of Hormuz remains in effect closed, and that is one of the things that have been sort of a sticky point since the onstart of this war. The Iranian regime still has pretty much control over the Strait of Hormuz, where, as you know, 1/5 of the world oil exports go through. And so that was something that President Trump yesterday said that he's not worried about it, open itself up. But as you guys have mentioned throughout the past 10 minutes, he then went back and said actually winding down operations or the military presence in Iran. So it's still something that is being discussed now. It doesn't help that over the past week, Iran's chief security advisor, Ali Larijani, was killed. Now, he was seen as someone who was sat at the table pre-war, who was sat at the table along with other figures that have been killed. And so we have our own sources telling us that Western intelligence at this point thinks that the killing of Ali Larijani practically means that it will be harder for countries including the UK and France and other countries in Europe to have their ships escorted through Iran. And as you remember, President Trump did say earlier that the US will try to get ships escorted through the Strait of Hormuz, but that is a very costly task that hasn't reaped a lot of fruit as we've seen so far. So effectively, the Strait of Hormuz, yes, there has been a little bit more movement. The AP reported last week that we've seen 90 tankers or so move through, but that is way, way below the numbers that we used to see before the onstart of this war in the Middle East.
Skylar, before we have to go, I do want to ask you about this OFAC waiver, these sanctions waivers that the White House issued. Who does that really benefit? Because when you look at it, the U.S. does not buy Iranian oil. Most of that Iranian oil is already spoken for by China. So essentially, didn't the White House just give China a discount on oil and let Iran make money from oil the U.S. didn't want it to sell?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I mean, I think...
What is the White House saying about why this is a good thing? Let's go this way.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, I think the administration, you know, what they're trying to do, really anything surrounding this war, they want it to appear as a positive for Americans. Even if, talked about the Strait of Hormuz, trying to get goods through, can't get fertilizer through, planting season for farmers is starting. So they're trying to sort of spin anything that can look positive for Americans here in the U.S. And yeah, I mean, that raises questions because, look, President Trump was supposed to go to China. I was supposed to be going to China next weekend. So, you know, and that trip is now delayed / postponed. So there are tons of questions.
Is it just about trying to show that they're doing something?
Yes, because I think so many people, when this war started, and still now, even though the president is laying out these bullet points, everyone is still really trying to figure out what was the goal.
What was the mission
of this war that was started. And even if the president says it's winding down, he's still eyeing sending 2,000 plus Marines to the Middle East, and that doesn't sound like winding down if you're saying you're winding down,
or if you're being
troops in.
or if you're being called up. All right, thank you so much.